Hi, I'm Nick Cipollina. In today's video, we're going to talk about working with container images with Serverless Framework and C# in AWS Lambda. In December of 2020, Amazon announced that they were going to start supporting Docker container images for serverless applications. What this means is that you can package up your entire application within your container, including the runtime, and no longer have to worry about which runtimes AWS Lambda supports. If you'll recall in my previous video, I talked about working with the Serverless Framework and C# in AWS Lambda, and we had to deploy our application to the .NET Core 3.1 framework because that was the latest version that AWS Lambda supports. With the introduction of container image support, we can now target the .NET 5.0 framework with our AWS Lambda functions. So let's take a look at what that would look like. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the templates that are available from the Amazon Lambda tools that we installed in my previous video on working with the Serverless Framework and C#. If you recall, in order to see the list of templates, we just issue a .NET new lambda -list, and this is going to show us all the templates that are available for Lambda functions. The two that we're interested in are the Lambda empty function .NET 5 container and the Lambda empty serverless .NET 5 container. And you can see that the names are serverless.image. These two templates, if we use either one of them, they're going to create a new Lambda function that is hosted inside of a Docker container image. So let's go ahead and create that new function. So we're going to make a directory for it, and we'll call this serverless container. And we are going to do a .NET new serverless image empty server. We're going to call this function our serverless container, and the output is going to be in our serverless container directory, and create. And what that's going to do is that's going to stub out a new function for us that has a Docker file which describes our container image. So if we change directories there and go to the source directory and serverless container, and we look, we can see what was created. So again, very similar to working with the serverless functions in our previous video, you can see we've got a function CS file, our CS project, the JSON file, the template, the README, but it also contains a Docker file. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that actually looks like. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to open up this project and see what we have created. Okay, now that we've got our function open, you'll notice that in the README file, we've got some information about the project that we've just created. And the part that I want to kind of key in here on is the packaging this as a Docker image. So let me show you what the Docker file looks like that was generated. As you can see, it's pulling from Amazon's container registry for .NET 5, but it's just copying the output of the publish folder under bin release into the container. So by default, what Amazon is expecting you to do is to go ahead and build and publish your application on your machine, and then it's going to package that into the container file. And while that's a great way to get started, I actually think it's more useful to use the methodology that Microsoft recommends with packaging .NET Core applications into containers and actually building the application within the container. And so the README file contains a definition for the Docker file that will do just that for you. So let's go ahead and open that Docker file back up, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to paste that into the Docker file with our new build instructions. So you can see we're still pulling from their base image, but then we're pulling from the Microsoft base image to do the build within the container and the publish, and then we're going to go ahead and put that into the container image that we got from AWS. Now you'll notice that there's no command or entry point defined at the end of this Docker file, and we'll go ahead and take care of that later on whenever we actually deploy this thing to serverless. So we'll come back to that, but for now, this is what our Docker file is going to look like. And then the next thing that I want to show you is the function.cs class. And so if you'll remember from my previous video, this function.cs class looks very similar to what we worked with before. It's just a simple function that takes a get from an API gateway. It logs that, the fact that we got a request, and then it just responds with hello AWS serverless. Not particularly interesting, but for the purposes of this demonstration, it does exactly what we need to do. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add our serverless.yaml file to our project. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now, and we will call this serverless YAML, and we will go ahead and update that with the information that we need to deploy this. And so the first thing that I'll call out is that the top of the serverless YAML file is very familiar. We're just naming our application. We're still using the AWS provider. We're still using the latest Lambda hashing version. But this is where things get a little bit different. So now we've got an ECR definition with an images section that contains an app image with a path. And what this actually is doing is this is saying that this particular serverless application contains a container image, and it's going to be called app image, and it's going to be located in the current directory. So what serverless will actually do when we do a deploy for this, it will actually look for the Docker file in this location. It'll build it. It will create the ECR container registry. It'll publish the container image to the ECR container registry, then create the Lambda function that points at that container image. And then we still have our function definition. So we've got our function that we're calling C#skill. But instead of defining a handler, we're pointing to an image, and it's looking for an image named app image, which happens to match the name that we gave up here in the ECR section. And then we're also defining a command. And this command is should look very familiar because it's the exact same syntax that we use whenever we're defining a Lambda function in a C# serverless application that's targeting, say, like the 3.1 runtime or even the 2.1 runtime. It's in the fully qualified domain format where we're using the serverless container assembly and the namespace serverless container. The class is called functions, and then the method's called get. And then we're still defining our HTTP event with a path of hello and a method of get. So like I said, very similar to what we've done with other serverless applications. So now if we take and open our command line back up, now that we've added our serverless support to this, let's go ahead and clear this out and do a serverless deploy. Also, before I do that, once again, you do have to define your AWS profile. Serverless will use your default profile that you have configured, or in my case, I actually have environment variables defined for the access ID and the secret access key, and serverless will just use those, but just wanted to make sure I pointed that out. This application. And it's going to take a little while to get started, but it's going to go ahead. And as we watch this, you're going to see that it's going to go ahead and package up the service, and then it's going to start actually building the container image, which you can see if you've ever built a Docker container before. This all should look very familiar. And what it's going to do is it'll build that image, package it up, and push it out to ECR. So if we go out to Amazon while that's building, if we take a look, you can see we currently don't, it's there already. That was pretty quick. So it created our repository for us, and it just called it serverless-container-dev. And so that's the default naming convention that serverless uses whenever it creates an ECR repository for you. It just calls it serverless, and then appends your service name and then the stage, which, if you recall, the default stage for a serverless application is dev. come back here and check on the progress. It's still building that container image. And then the other thing that it's going to add for us is it'll add a Lambda function for us, which isn't there yet, and our API gateway as well. But that'll be a few minutes until that's done. So there you can see it has actually created the image and pushed it to the repository. So if we jump into the repository, we can see that there is an app image here. It was pushed at this time and this morning, and we can see the size of the image. We can get the image URI and etc. We can also scan the image for any vulnerabilities. And then the other thing that's pretty cool about working with ECR is you can view the push commands here to see if you actually wanted to build and push your container to ECR, how you can do that. So that's something that's pretty convenient that Amazon provides with the ECR service that they have. So if we go look, it is still uploading. So let's go back to our Lambda functions because we may actually start to see. Yep, here's our serverless function. That's our container app function. And you'll notice here that the package type for this serverless function or this Lambda function is image. And if we come in here and look at this, it's going to look very similar to what we've worked with before with serverless applications. You can see that we've got an API gateway trigger. This is the URI to the container image. So that's kind of interesting to note is that your container image is still within ECR, and the AWS Lambda uses that container image from ECR. You'll notice that we defined our command override, and that shows up here. And let's go look at API gateway. We should have an API gateway. Yes, we do. And let's see here. Yep, our function is done deploying. And so now we should be able to test this out to see if it works. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on that. And it should, if everything works, say hello AWS serverless, which is exactly what we expected because that's what the function does. It just returns hello AWS serverless. Okay, so that's pretty cool. And so that shows how we can build an application using a container image with serverless all in one step. But in the real world, if you're working with a CI/CD pipeline, you're probably going to want to have separate steps where you build your container and then in a separate step, release that container to your AWS Lambda function. And so let's go ahead and see what that would look like, because that is something that serverless also supports. It doesn't have to build the container as part of the deployment. You can separate those into separate steps. So let's go ahead and make a change to our application here. Kind of a small contrived change, but we'll make it anyway. Var name equals request dot query string parameters name and name, and otherwise we're going to say hold on, that would be otherwise we'll say WS serverless and come down here and change that to say hello name. So what that'll do is that'll actually take a query string parameter of name and return that name. And if there is no query string parameter, it'll just return AWS serverless. And the other thing that we have to do is we have to update our serverless YAML file to not package up our container image. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll go ahead and remove this section because we no longer want to package it up. And then we need to update our the image section of the function definition so that it'll pull from our ECR registry instead of looking for it locally. And we do this by providing the URI to the registry and the digest value for the container image that we actually want to deploy to from serverless. And we'll get that from the push command to the serverless repository, or to the ECR repository. So again, like I said, because Amazon provides these commands, we're just going to go ahead and use these to build and deploy our serverless container. So the first thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and get our ECR login command. And then after that, we will go ahead and build our container image. And so this is should look very similar if you've ever built a Docker container. We're simply just going to issue a Docker build. Okay, now that that's done building, we can go ahead and we can tag our image. And after it's done, we'll go ahead and push that container image to ECR. And we tag that image as latest. So if we come out here to ECR, we should see, yep, you can see the image with the tag of latest has now been deployed. So if we come back here, we need, if you remember, we need the digest value for the container image. So we're going to go ahead and copy this, and we're going to set that to an environment variable called digest. All right. And the reason we did that is that in our URI, we are looking for an environment variable called digest that we're going to append to the end of our URI. And so that's how we do that. And so now if we come back to our command line, we should just be able to issue a serverless deploy again, and it should go out and deploy our serverless function using the container image that we pushed in a separate process. And if you think about a typical CI/CD pipeline, that's exactly how you would do this. You would build your container image, you would push it to your registry, and then in a separate release process, you would get that same container image and you would deploy that, and you could do the same thing with an environment variable. And so it's updating that now. So let's go back to AWS and take a look at our Lambda function, and it should update soon. If we just refresh. And yep, you can see it's now using a different digest value, which is the one that we define here. And yep, it's done deploying. So now if we refresh our API gateway, it should say hello AWS serverless. And now if I say name Nick, it should say hello Nick. And it did. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to include a link to the documentation for working with container images in AWS Lambda in the description down below, as well as a link to my GitHub repository and the previous video that I did on working with the serverless framework in C#. And I hope you'll join me again in future videos. Thank you.